Okay, so the real business cycle. I mean, the important part here is real. I guess we'll get down here, but so we're gonna have rational expectations. We're gonna have a general equilibrium where all the markets clear. It's basically gonna be a modified neoclassical growth model that we've already studied. The difference is we're gonna have stochastic shocks to technology. Stochastic just means random here. So it's going to be like that neoclassical growth model, but you remember there you could sort of predict, right? Each agent in the economy, each person trying to decide what should my consumption path be, they knew exactly what it was going to be. In this real business cycle model, you're not going to be able to know for sure because you're going to have these shocks that are going to affect your income and prices that are going to make consumption as well something that can't be perfectly predicted. And it turns out that that makes the model much more difficult to solve. And as we saw in class, in our exercise class, even the simple models that we wrote down, even the simple neoclassical growth model, you need to go to a computer to solve. So, I mean, for these RBC models, that's going to be even more true. The real business cycle model is real. It does not have any money in it. Money doesn't matter. There's going to be no market power, no frictions. It's going to be efficient because there's not going to be any monopoly power or anything like that. There's no coordination failures. And there's not going to be any role for policy. So anything the government does, just because of the way that we're counting welfare and the way that we're defining things, there's no market power, no frictions. There's never going to be any role for government policy. So one message of the model is that anything the government does is going to be bad, but that's almost baked in from the beginning. So in a word, how far can we go just with production function shocks? So can we explain the way that the economy changes, or the business cycle completely, without thinking of any complicated expectations or multiple equilibria or anything like that? Just production function shocks. Okay, that's all we're going to have, and we're going to see if that's going to help us understand, or if we're going to at least be able to replicate what we see in the real world in terms of sometimes getting twice as much cake, sometimes getting half as much. Maybe it's just that, the cake recipe does better sometimes than it does other times. A few facts about economic fluctuations. These you can almost just read off the slides as well as me saying them, but modern economies have significant short-run variation in output. So, as I've said here, expansion from 1990 to 2000, recession in 2001, this is in the United States, but I imagine also true in the EU, I don't know that for sure. Expansion during this period, great recessions here, and we have had expansion until this month. I don't know what's going on with production, those numbers haven't come out yet, but certainly the stock market, well, let's be honest, we know what's happening with production. We're shutting down firms left and right in the economy. There's going to be less produced. So production has I'm sure fallen dramatically during this 1 month. How long it's going to last, we don't know, but it could last for a while. So it looks like we're going to be in some sort of recession again starting from this month. All right, so just to give you some sense of scale, from 2007 to 2009, so from the top of the expansion to the trough of the recession, the U.S. GDP fell by 3.8%, meaning about 4% less was produced in 2009 than was produced in 2007. So that's the kind of scales we're looking at here. The employment to population ratio fell 3.1 percentage points. So again, there was a lot of unemployment during the Great Recession. And then just as a general point, there's no way to predict these fluctuations. There's no regular pattern. There's no seasonal pattern. We never know when the next one's going to hit until we're kind of in it. So for instance, right now, I expect we're in some sort of recession because of the coronavirus. How long it's going to last, I have no idea. We already saw this graph. Post-war GDP looks like that. You can draw a nice straight line with a slope of about a slope of 0.3 on a log scale. Let's try that again. I think I can hit it better like this. That looks better. Somewhat better. Maybe here. That's probably better. That's the best one, that top one. You can't really see that 0.3 or 0.03 slope here because these numbers, even though the scale is in logs, they're written in levels, as you can see. So 20,000 is far away from 30,000, and 30,000 is away from 40,000, etc. So how long are recessions? Well, not really clear. Don't really know. Some of them are 2 quarters, some of them are 5 quarters, some of them are 1 quarter. How big are they? That depends too. There are different sizes. Some are relatively serious, some are relatively moderate. That one quite moderate. So yeah, output movements aren't regular. Basically, this view of at least of the RBC model is that the economy is kind of perturbed by shocks that are totally unpredictable. The shocks somehow propagate through the economy. Maybe if prices are sticky, then uncertainty shocks affect employment or something. But exactly the way that these shocks happen and how they propagate, that's really the focus of our research here. Some kind of interesting facts about the way that recessions hit the economy. So there's this quote by Alan Blinder that says, "The business cycle, to a surprisingly large degree, is an inventory cycle." So what do I mean by that? Let's look down here. How much does consumption fall during a recession? Well, consumption is usually made up of about 8.9% durables, 20% non-durables, and 35% services. So these are components of GDP. So that's why these don't sum to 100. But basically what happens is consumption of durables falls the most during a recession, but consumption of non-durables and services also falls. Why is that? Well, if you think about it, when are you going to buy a new car? It's not going to be during a recession when your wages are low and you might lose your job. You're going to buy it during a period when times are booming. So that's why durables looks different than non-durables. With investment, so you can see we have several types of investment here: residential investment, fixed non-residential investment. So people buy less homes. They buy even less stocks during a recession. Maybe surprising. Maybe you should buy stocks during a recession. But the main thing here you see that changes is inventories. So why is that? Well, first of all, why are we counting inventories as part of investment? It's sort of a GDP accounting exercise. If I'm a firm and I produce something but I don't sell it this year, I sell it next year, how do I think about that thing I produced? Well, it's something that's going to make me more productive next year, right? I'm going to be able to sell that next year. So not more productive, but yeah, we could say that, more productive. More productive is the wrong, okay, you can't really say that. It's the wrong way to say that. But the point is, the firm is going to sell that next year. So we think about stocks of inventories as a firm's investment. That's how we count it in GDP. It was produced this year. It needs to be counted somehow. It's not consumption. We call it investment. Okay. So what happens during a recession? Basically, inventories tank. They really fall a lot. Why is that? Because okay, I'm back. Sorry, I was just I confused myself for a second because I was thinking about why inventories should fall during a recession rather than grow. So if you think about inventories, it's like the amount that the firm has on hand that they haven't sold. So I wanted to say that during a recession, you'd expect inventories to grow, right? Because then the firm is sort of piling up, the production still rolls on, but people aren't demanding the goods as much and it takes some time to adjust. Well, it turns out that actually it's not that easy to explain why inventories fall during a recession. You might expect them to be counter-cyclical, but they're actually pro-cyclical. They rise during booms and they fall during busts. and actually there's quite a bit of work by economists trying to explain this somewhat surprising fact. Just to give you an idea, there's a model called the SS model of inventories, and what that says is that oh, hold on one second, my wife is calling. All right, sorry about that. So anyway, yeah, there's this SS model of inventories that says that when you're a firm, you want to kind of keep a certain amount of inventory on hand in order to meet any sort of surprise demand that you have, and sort of you want to keep your inventories in a certain band. And then what happens is when you deplete them to a certain degree, then you want to sort of accumulate a bunch more. So what's happening during a recession is that firms are just depleting their inventories, but they're never getting to the bottom. Or alternatively, maybe the band changes and they don't need to have as many inventories around as usual. So that's the sort of explanation that people have come up with, but it's a somewhat surprising fact on the face of it. But it turns out that that's actually driving a lot of accounting, at least in terms of accounting, what's happening during recessions. All right, net exports. What happens to them on average? So first of all, why is the average share negative? At least in the United States, that's because the United States runs a trade deficit, which means that it imports more than it exports. All right, so that means that the contribution to GDP of exports is actually negative. So what happens during a recession? Well, it turns out that you export even less, and import even more. That's not a super huge surprise. Domestic production is dropping, so you're going to export less. Production abroad may or may not be affected. And then finally, government purchases. What happens to that? That falls a bit during a recession, but not too much, typically because governments are trying to sort of stimulate the economy. Why is it falling at all? There's some sort of built-in reasons why that might happen. I'll just leave it at that. Okay, so what about some important macroeconomic variables? What happens during a recession? Well, it turns out that in a recession, always real GDP falls. Why is that? Because that is the definition of a recession, so it would be impossible for this not to be 11 out of 11. Employment falls during a recession. Unemployment always rises during a recession, not surprising. And finally, for the ones that are always true, average hours also always falls. So what that means is that even if you're still working, you don't work as many hours on average. Okay, I actually have a colleague who studies this and says that firms don't like to fire workers. They like to just reduce their hours because you have to train workers. You don't want to fire them. Anyway, output for non-farm businesses output per hour usually falls during a recession. That's not necessarily something that has to be true. If you think about it, maybe if you're firing workers, you might fire the least productive first, in which case, productivity is rising at the same time demand is falling, so you might not know which direction that might go. Inflation, it's hard to say. About half the time it falls, but half the time it doesn't. So somewhat a puzzle, I guess. Compensation, again, sometimes falls, sometimes doesn't. I think that has to do a little bit with this fact that I just said, that you might fire your least productive workers first. Nominal interest rate almost always falls on treasury bills. So that means people want to hold T-bills, a safe asset, right? A loan to the American government. You expect the American government to be able to pay you back. So sort of the amount that the American government has to pay you back is falling during a recession because people want to hold on to those safe assets. The ex-post real interest rate, those are also typically falling, but although not always. Again, we have this interesting inflation fact. So the difference between the nominal and the real rate of return here is just inflation, and sometimes that's falling, sometimes it's not. And then finally, the real money stock How does that? What happens in that one? Well, sometimes it falls, sometimes it rises. That's all there is to say about that. Related to inflation. Okay, so the big question we want to ask is, can we explain this stuff with a frictionless micro-founded model where the only shocks are real shocks, no money, no weird sticky prices, no coordination failures, nothing weird going on here? Only shocks to technology and potentially government purchases. We're going to call that the real business cycle model.